Chapter 25 Legend of the Dionysiac Artificers. We now approach a very interesting topic in the legendary history of Masonry. The reader has already seen in the last chapter that the Masons of the kingdom of Tyre were invited to join with the Jewish builders in the construction of the temple. Who these Tyrian Masons were, what was their character, whence they came, and what was the influence exerted by them on the Jewish workmen with whom they were united in a common labor, are questions which can only be solved by a reference to what may be called the legend of the Dionysiac Artificers. This legend was entirely unknown to the old Masons of the Middle Ages. There is no reference to it in any of the manuscripts. The brief allusion to the Dionysiacs of Asia Minor in Robison's anti-Masonic work does not necessarily connect them with the Masons of King Solomon. Footnote. Proofs of a Conspiracy, page 20. The first writer who appears to have started the theory that the Masons sent by King Hiram to the King of Israel were members of the Dionysiac fraternity is Sir David Brewster, who presented the legend under the guise of an historic statement in the History of Freemasonry, published in the beginning of this century, and the authorship of which, although it was actually written by him, has been falsely attributed to Alexander Lowry, the bookseller of Edinburgh, and, at the time, the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. Brewster may, therefore, I think, be fairly considered as the original framer of the legend. The origin of the mystical and architectural society, which Brewster closely connects with the Masons of the Temple, may be given in almost his own words. Footnote. Lowry's History of Freemasonry, first edition, page 27. Between 1055 and 1044, years before Christ, or something more than half a century anterior to the building of the temple, the inhabitants of Attica, complaining of the narrowness of their territory and the unfruitfulness of the soil, went in quest of more extensive and fertile settlements. Being joined by a number of the inhabitants of the surrounding provinces of Greece, they sailed to Asia Minor and drove out the inhabitants of that portion of the western coast from Phoenicia in the north to Miletus in the south. To this narrow strip of land they gave the name of Ionia, because the greatest number of the adventurers were natives of that Grecian state. After partly subduing and partly expelling the original inhabitants, they built several towns, of which one of the principal was Teos. Prior to this emigration, the Greeks had made considerable progress in the arts and sciences which the adventurers carried with them into their new territory, and they introduced into Ionia the mysteries of Pallas and Dionysus, before they had become corrupted by the licentiousness of the Athenians. Especially popular, not only in Ionia, but throughout Asia Minor, were the mysteries of Dionysus, the Roman Bacchus. In these, as in all the religious mysteries of antiquity, there was a funeral legend. In the Dionysiac mysteries, the legend of initiation represented the death of the demigod Dionysus, the search for and discovery of his body, and his subsequent restoration to life. In the initiations, the candidate was made to represent, in his own person, the events connected with the slaying of the hero god. After a variety of preparatory ceremonies intended to call forth all his fortitude and courage, the aphonism or mystical death of Dionysus, torn to pieces by the Titans, was presented in a dramatic form and followed by the confinement or burial of the candidate as the representative of Dionysus in the pastos, couch, or coffin, all of which constituted the first part of the ceremony of initiation. Then began the search for the remains of Dionysus, which was continued amid scenes of the greatest confusion and tumult, until at last, the search having been successful, the mourning was turned to joy, light succeeded to darkness, and the candidate was invested with the knowledge of the secret doctrine of the mysteries, the belief in the existence of one God and a future and immortal state. Footnote. La muerte de Bacchus, mis amort et déchire en pieces par les Titans, et son retourne à la vie ont été le sujet de explications allégoriques tout à fait analogues à celles que Ion a données de l'enlèvement de Proserpine et du muerte de Osiris, Sylvester de Tracy in Saint Croix, Recherets sur les mysteries du paganisme, T2, page 86. Now these mysteries of Dionysus were very intimately connected with a society of architects, as this association, according to the legend which we are now considering, had much to do with the organization of Masonry at the Solomonic Temple, it is necessary to take a brief notice of its origin and character. It is an historical fact that at the time of the building of the temple at Jerusalem, there existed at Tyre, as well as in other parts of Asia Minor, an association known as the Dionysian architects, because they joined to the practice of operative architecture the observance of the religious rites of the Dionysiac mysteries. It has been already stated that the priests of Dionysus had devoted themselves to the study and the practice of architecture, and about 1,000 years before the Christian era, or at the time that King Solomon began the construction of the temple at Jerusalem, had emigrated from Greece and established themselves as a society or fraternity of builders in Asia Minor, and devoted themselves to the construction of temples and other public edifices. Footnote. Chandler says the Dionysists were artificers or contractors for the Asiatic theaters, and were incorporated and settled at Chios under the kings of Pergamum. Travels in Asia Minor, Volume 1, Chapter 28, page 123. This was at a later period than the era of the temple. Hiram, who then reigned over the kingdom of Tyre, and who, from his cultivation of the sciences, has been styled the Augustus of his age, is said to have patronized these religious builders, and to have employed them in the magnificent works by which he adorned and strengthened his capital. The internal government and the usages of this association, very similar to those exhibited by the Masonic Society in the present day, and which the legendary theory supposes to have prevailed among the builders of the Solomonic Temple. The fraternity was divided into communities called Synoechiae, footnote, Antiquitates Asiaticae, Christianam, Aram, Antecedentes, page 139. Having houses or dwellings in common, which might well be compared to the Masonic lodges of the present day, their plans of meeting were also called in Greek koinonia, which signifies communities, and each received a distinctive name, just as our lodges do. Thus, Shishol speaks in his account of the pre-Christian antiquities of Asia of a koinon ton, ataliston, or a community of the Atalistae, so called most probably in honor of King Attalus, who was their patron. Footnote. Rollin's Universal History places Attalus in the rank of those princes who loved and patronized letters and the arts. There was an annual festival, like the General Assembly or Grand Lodge of the Masons, which was held with great pomp and ceremony. Chandler says, but he speaks of a later period when they were settled at Chios, that it was the custom of their synod to hold yearly a general assembly, at which they sacrificed to the gods and poured out libations to their deceased benefactors. They likewise celebrated games in honor of Bacchus. The crowns which had been bestowed by any of the communities as rewards of merit were announced by heralds, and the wearers of them were applauded by the other members. These meetings, he adds, were solemnized with great pomp and festivity. Footnote. Chandler, Travels in Asia Minor, Volume 1, Chapter 30, page 126.